good morning friends. Welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, with our ongoing series on Indian writing in English, so far we have conducted a number of sessions under the series. Today also we would be discussing a new topic under the series, and today's topic of discussion is impact of West on Indian imagination. And for this very discussion, we have once again with us in our studios Professor Anand Prakash. Professor Anand Prakash is a retired professor from Department of English, University of Delhi, and I usually say and always say that Professor Anand Prakash has always to give a better insight into what actually exists. So we believe that today also we are going to get in-depth knowledge on the topic under his able guidance. So without wasting any time, I would like to welcome our guest, Professor Anand Prakash. Professor Prakash, welcome to the EduSet lecture.
Thank you, Geetika, and welcome viewers. And today's topic, as has been announced by Geetika, is impact of the West on Indian imagination. It sounds a bit, heavy, but I'll be chatting about it. I'll be making a few points, and these points will be under the heads that I tell you straight away. For instance, the first point would be about the Orientalists who became active in India or in the West, thinking about India, and they took up the cause of India in a big way. This will, help us understand how Indians started responding to their definition by the Orientalists. The second point that I will be talking about is the West asserting their superiority. Were they superior? Were they inferior to us? Well, this is a topic that is being discussed, and it has been discussed ever since the Western people set foot on our soil. One should not, go into comparing and contrasting, but there would be certain differences that one has to understand. And if they asserted their superiority, then they had a logic, and I'll explain that logic to you with its salient features. The third point that I'll take up today is regarding Romanticism in Europe in general and in England in particular, because it is this that appealed to the Indian mind, particularly who were the elites at that time, who knew English, who had been to schools and colleges, and who were mostly creative writers or people of the upper castes and classes, and they started being moved by, stirred by what went on in the West in the name of Romanticism. So under these broader heads, I would be just conversing with you, and let's see how the argument shapes up in its process. The first thing that I say regarding Westerns in India, Western people in India, is that the traffic of the Western people, the traffic of people in the West, and they were English, they were French, they were Dutch, that increased in the latter half of the 18th century. They were there in the time of early Mughals, particularly in times of Akbar. The Western people came in order to trade with us. They had their goods which they wanted to supply here, to sell here, and they also had interest in the Indian goods which they would take from here to their own countries, and there they would sell. So this kind of a trading on this scale that happened in Mughal India had not been there earlier. So this was a very healthy kind of interaction between the two productive forces, between the two productive communities, between the two productive processes, and there was always that scope of what can be called mutual learning. And this continued till the 18th century, and as I said in one of the earlier discussions, in the 18th century, what happened was that India was not able to maintain its tempo of production and of progress. I went into the historical reasons for this to a certain extent, to the extent to which this is relevant to us in our study of literature. Not more than that. It's a topic for the historians and economists to discuss, and what we should be aware of these disciplines and these interests, because then alone can we understand the niceties and the subtleties of the literary argument. So India had become weaker in its productive and thinking capacities. It was still stuck with what happened earlier, and the kind of progress that is expected of dynamic societies, that they change with time. that they take influences and they also give influences, that they understand things from their own life and start and restructure and reform all that they have said and done earlier. So this process is very healthy, but this process became weak in the 18th century, because of which the Western people who till now had been trading with us on a par, on the level of equality, these people had the upper hand gradually, and more and more people would be interested. English people were very interested in the latter half of the 18th century about what went on here, and they had started behaving not just economically, not in economic terms, but also in political terms. They started, for instance, contacting the people who were high and mighty, and they would sometimes meet them in order to influence their policies. And if there was a fight between one section of the Indian ruling section and another, then they would dabble in that kind of narrow, petty politics. This also happened, and with every intervention that the Britishers did and the French did and the Dutch did, their influence increased. So their influence increased, which means it worked to the disadvantage of, to the detriment of Indian interests. And things came to such a pass, and I mentioned this particularly, that in the 1860s, an understanding was reached and it was formalized between the British East India Company and the Indian Mughal king. And the understanding was that the revenue that the king was extracting from his subjects, particularly in the eastern part of India, central and eastern part of India, that revenue would now be collected not by the Mughals but by the East India Company, and they will be then using it for their benefit. This was a tremendous blow to the economic interests of India, and in fact the process of colonization happened at that very time. I am not going into that today. What I am saying is that Britishers would now be much more interested in Indian affairs than they were earlier. They had to manage the economy of India. They had to manage the monetary resources of India, and they had to make a still stronger place in India, so that this kind of progress towards mastering India the resources would continue. And with hindsight, one can say that this process kept increasing. But then in the latter half of the 18th century, certain processes began. So I have to talk about these processes, because then alone can we understand how our life and our thought was impacted by the Britishers in particular. And the impact came in the form of, let's say, that if a foreign power, if a foreign trade company has to manage the economic affairs of our society, it would mean lots of things. It would mean going to the cities, going to the small towns, even to the villages, and extracting revenue is not an easy job. So maybe sometimes they have to use power, sometimes they have to use persuasive capacity, and if you have to persuade the village economy, the people who are active in the village economy, if you have to persuade the small town traders, if you have to go to the big traders in the cities, then of course you have to learn the ways of the country where they are operating. This is essential. Without that, you can't really influence the policies of a country, particularly in the situation in which the Britishers found themselves in the latter half of the 18th century. And with whom would they trust in order to involve people so that the revenue could be collected? Now, revenue is economics. Revenue is money, and you extract it, and there is a kind of a tax that you take, and tax cannot be easily taken. You go to a person who has the money, who has been active in the previous year in agriculture, for instance, or in the Indian goods, and there you have to persuade this person. And how do you persuade this person? Now, this is a very complex process. There have to be arguments. There have to be some kind of mutual give and take. There has to be a polite exchange. There has to be some kind of a camaraderie, some kind of fellow feeling. You have to make yourself the ruler, the person who is conducting this particular activity has to become amiable. So all these things were required. They were the requirements of the time, and it fell on the Britishers in the latter half of the 18th century to take up this job seriously, for which purpose they involved more and more people from their own country to come here, to study the ways and means of this country, to study the manners of this country, to study the life processes of this country, and to establish a kind of rapport that had not existed earlier. So, many people came, a large number of groups came to India, and these groups consisted of experts, they consisted sometimes even of philosophers, of political analysts, who would guide the East India Company to, towards holding or getting a bigger grip, a stronger grip on the Indian affairs. So all these sections, all these committees, all these things were created in the latter half of the 18th century, and the Britishers would come, and when people shift from one place to another, to a place of work particularly, then they don't come alone. They come with their spouses, sometimes they come with their families, and these people came to India in the years that I am talking about. So, I don't have to go into that, but let me indicate that if the Britishers come to India to do a job here, and the job is monetary, the job is philosophical, the job is political, the job is of different kinds, even cultural. So that job requires a greater interest in the mind of the person who is coming here. And if these jobs are created in India, then who is the beneficiary? It's a simple question, but it's a very interesting question. Obviously, if there is a scarcity of jobs in England, and some jobs are being created, for the Englishmen here, then we are solving their economic problems. We are solving their economic crisis. So there might have been a crisis sometime in the latter half of the 18th century in England, and the early years of the 19th century, and this economic crisis could be solved by the economy and the society of another country, and this country gradually will move towards what is called being colonized. It will become a colony. So I am not going into that at the moment. I am simply saying that there will be a greater interaction of the Indians and the foreigners, particularly English, because that interaction is the requirement of the hour. So this happened here. So I indicated earlier, but in this particular discussion, let me tell you that the manners of Indians, in different parts of the country, and particularly in that part where they were to be specifically active, those manners were studied. They were properly examined. They were properly investigated. People came here. What is called the burning of the midnight oil. They did that. They worked overtime. These people who came from outside, they would go to the villages. They would stay there, and then from there, they would write back reports to their masters here as well as back in England. So this process, that they came close to us, etc. This required those people to study India's affairs and take interest in India as much as possible. And they would be definitely using a language. Which language should they use? Well, two languages had to be used. One was their own, that is English, and the other was the language of the Indians. And India had, let's say, a number of languages in different parts of the country, and therefore they had to learn our language. And if they learn our language, then they learn by interacting more with us at the level of linguistics. So they would be opening schools. They would be meeting the scholars here. They would be meeting those who wrote, who composed things. So this interaction, it appears quite simple and simplistic, but you come to think of it, you imagine how a foreigner comes here and then he studies our ways and manners, and in the process he is also revealing his ways and manners. So he is educating himself with respect to the Indian reality, and at the same time, in the process, he is educating Indians in Britishers, terms of reality. So this process began in a big way, and it was quite, at that point of time, equality oriented. These people came with a genuine curiosity, and the Indians would not know how to treat them, how to take them, how to respond to them, because Indians were at that point of time conducting themselves from the position of inferiority. They were weak, they were caste ridden, they had orthodox ways, their religion didn't allow them any kind of freedom. Religion had to be interpreted by people who were well versed in Sanskrit, for instance, classical the language Sanskrit, or Persian, if one happened to be at that time Muslim, therefore and Arabic. But then, and what was the advantage of English people? They were not pursuing their, for instance, religious interests in the classical language, which would be Hebrew or which would be Latin. They would not be discussing that. They had way back, in the 15th and 16th centuries, translated their holy book into the language of the ordinary masses. And in the 16th century, and the 16th century is quite close to the 18th century in India, they had finally brought out what is called the authoritative version of the Bible. It's called the King James Bible, or version of the Bible. So, and a large number of best scholars in the country were involved in that project. Now, they came with a religion, they came with a set of beliefs, they came with a language which was close to their heart, which was close to the reality of their time. And here in India, the serious philosophical religious pursuit was being carried on through a language which was classical, which means that it was confined to a minuscule section of society. The Brahmins, for instance, would know what Sanskrit would mean, and Brahmins would interpret it the way they wanted, and which means that the Indians were at that point of time rather weak in the philosophical, intellectual, or even spiritual discourse. I'm emphasizing this point a little more because this discourse, this weakness of discourse will finally show Indians their sense of inferiority, because they are taking their dictum from the upper caste, from the Brahmin, who alone knows what is there in the or the Maulvi, the Muslim scholar, would know only as to what is written in their holy text. But so far as the people from outside came, they knew what was there in the holy text, because this was available to them in an authorized version of the English of the time when the version was prepared. So I'm saying that at the level of language, the English had an advantage. So they would learn our languages, and which languages would they learn? They would they would learn not our classical languages as much as they would learn our simple language in which people carried their affairs. So at the level of language, this kind of a thing has to be always kept in mind. So then when this kind of a process began with respect to the study of the language, then the Britishers realized, and this realization occurred in a big way in the 1880s and 90s, and they were struck by the philosophies, the philosophical debates, the discourses, the explanations, the insights of the ancient sages. They knew, that these people were not ordinary people, and that they had at one point of time, maybe way back in the early years of the Christian era, these people had gone into different aspects of spirituality, of mental processes, and that they were great seers, and that they were great scholars, and they were great visionaries. And on the one side was India, which was backward, which the British scholars saw, and on the other side was a very intelligent India, a very dynamic India way back in the past. And they saw this gap, and they might also have been struck by the fact that Indians had gone into the areas of spiritual and intellectual excellence much before their Western counterparts. So they were struck dumb to begin with, that this kind of wisdom that the East has carried in their heritage, and then they felt like making this wisdom available to their own people back home. And when that happens, they had to take up translation. So these people who were struck by what I use the word excellence, when they were struck by the excellence of Indian learning of the past, then they thought that they should make it available to the scholars back home, and therefore they took up the project of translating the Indian texts so that they could make the benefit available to people in their own countries. So since they were studying the East, they were studying the wisdom that had emanated from the experiences of life here, and the way it had been expressed in very succinct terms, very clear and telling and evocative terms, then they would be further moved by what linguistic things were there in the Indian scholarship, in the Indian tradition. So they were so much in love with these things, and they were so impressed by the meaning, by the depth, by the profundity of the Indian experience articulated in the old text, that they started calling themselves, or other people started calling them, Orientalists. And these Orientalists, would spread the message of in Indian learning outside. This happened, and the language at that point of time would be English for the Britishers. So they would write, so that they would translate, that they would publish, and then this publication would be read with avid interest in their country back home, and that's how the cause of India was somehow served better in the 1780s and 90s because of the presence of Orientalists here. And I talked about one particular Orientalist, William Jones, and even if one reads him today, maybe there are some mistakes here or there, but then the tone is that of respect. The tone of William Jones is that of paying some kind of a tribute, some kind of a homage to the insights that Indians had in their ancient past. Now, this was one aspect. The other aspect was that when they were doing this, then Indians would be deeply impressed by the engagement of the foreigners, that that their wisdom was taken from here to that place, and there are some Indians who would have read Sanskrit, but they would like to know as to what was being said in English. So they may have also had some kind of interest in English. Interest in English also increased, which it means that in the second half of the 18th century, particularly 1880s and 90s. So there would be certain camps, there would be certain groups in India, particularly from the upper classes, which would be studying English with as much seriousness as the Britishers here were studying Sanskrit or other languages and works in those languages. And this kind of a thing created groups here, which would take deep interest in the study of English. So Indians were studying English, and the Britishers were translating Indian texts after studying classical languages here into their own language. And that way, this was a very, very fruitful way. I'm not saying at the level of economics, but at the level of linguistics, at the level of writing, at the level of literature, this was a great boost to the activity of what can be called imagination. So imagination of both the parts, the Western part and the Indian part, that got a boost, in India in these years, and this would have created, even though small, even though people could be counted on fingertips, even then there were people who would be interested in knowing more and more through English, and these people belong to India. Now this is the time when the century turns into the next one, when the 19th century dawns, when it comes in the first decade of the 19th century. By this time there are quite a few people in certain parts of India who are taking interest in the study of English. Now let me tell you that this minor fact regarding the presence of the Western people in India, that in the early 19th century and in the previous decades of the 18th century, for instance 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s, most of the activity of the Britishers was confined to, let's say, the eastern part of the country. Mostly it was Bengal, or it would be Odisha, or it would be Tamil Nadu. Why? Why is it that they had that kind of presence in these particular places, Bengal, Odisha, and Tamil Nadu? The reason is simple, that they were generally using the passage of water, the seas. They would come here and they would be landing in Calcutta or in Odisha or in Tamil Nadu, and from there they would initiate their process of trade, and most of the money also would be business would be transacted in these port towns in the years that I'm mentioning. And for this reason these groups I'm talking about, these groups, which had interest in English more and more, these groups would be confined to, let's say, Bengal, Odisha, and Tamil Nadu. And very soon you would see, and when the new century comes, when 1900s come, 1800s come, 1800s come, that is 1800 to, let's say, 1810. By that time, some people in these parts of the country that I mentioned, these parts of the country would think of opening schools and colleges that will teach English, which was not the case earlier. There might have been one or two instances, but now educational activity will take that kind of a step towards learning of a language which was earlier thought to be an alien language. And now that they had people who would have read English through English, not through translation, directly, they would have studied English, these people would now make a demand, that there should be schools and colleges in India in the early years of the 19th century. And when this happens, then of course that something that has gone on so far at another level of society will now be a part of the academic curriculum. That a language will be studied. A language will not be studied merely through its grammar, but through the texts which have been composed in that language. And some of the contemporary writing also will be made available by the teachers, by the scholars, by the curriculum makers, by the syllabi makers. And when you read a language, when you study a language, you study a language not through its grammar but through its literature. So language will be popular in India. There will be small sections who would enjoy the new language. They would also language also would come in the form of literature. So poetry would be read here, novels would be read here, intellectual tracts, philosophical texts, analytical texts, even scientific books. All these would be read here around the curriculum. Not directly a part of it, but around the curriculum they would be read. And if people liked those books, then they would search for more books. And then they would talk about those books. The teachers, for instance, the scholars, for instance, they would talk about those books in their classes. And if they wrote something, if they published something, then they would refer to the contemporary books and the contemporary trends, and that way a very meaningful phenomenon would emerge in the early years of the 19th century. And this is something that is going to take root. If I was there in the 1890s, if people were there in the 1900s, then they would soon know that the future belongs to the study of English, to the study of English language, to the study of English literature, to the spoken part of the language, to interact, to discuss, to exchange views in that other language, and that this section then would enjoy this for various reasons. For instance, for the reason that the message that is coming through English is a different kind of a message, and the message that they have to convey has some other aspect to it, and the process of intermingling, etc., would be a part of the game. So this is where I stop, and well, it can be continued in a slightly different form later. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, one knows that the process that began in the early years of the 19th century was quite significant for us and for the Britishers, but then significant in one way and problematic in another. How was it problematic? You might ask. I might ask for myself. When the thing is positive, when the thing is inspiring, when people are learning English and they are also becoming conversant with literature of the period, then how is it problematic? And on the other side, if the Orientalists who came here from outside and they are translating Indian classical texts into their own languages, how does it become problematic? Well, this is a question that doesn't relate as much to literature as to the society around it. For instance, the people who learned English here, they had an impression, in the minds of the people, they left the impression that they were superior to others. Why? Because they were close to the centers of power. If you knew English, then you would be in touch with the Englishmen here. Englishmen were gaining more and more of privileges, more and more of importance, more and more of power in India. So you will be closer to the centers of power. So English came to be associated with power. It came to be associated with a higher status in life. And this would have created a sense of inferiority in those who didn't know English. And who knew English in the early part of the 19th century? The upper caste and the upper classes, the people with money, the people who could spend time on learning English, and then they would sometimes gain individual benefits from their closeness to others who knew English or who were working on behalf of English people here. So this is one aspect that the social prejudices and the social divisions occurred at the level of language. If you knew English, you were superior. If you didn't know English, then you were weak in conditions. So far as the interest of British scholars in India as Orientalists is concerned, let me tell you that if they go back home and they say that they have they are now controlling a country which had a very glorious history of the past, then they would not be heard with interest, because the Britishers generally back home would be getting more and more of benefit out of the interaction with the Indians, and this benefit is occurring not through languages but through economic exchanges. Therefore, they would not like to hear praises of India. They would say we are getting jobs there, and we go there, and we find the Indians very gullible, we find them very orthodox, we find them intellectually very weak, and these people, Orientalists, they are praising them sky high. So in a way, the value of the Orientalists will go down in the eyes of their own people. So which means that Orientalism in these years will be weakening. There will be not enough enthusiasm for those who would translate Indian classics into English and who would propagate the message of the Indian classics among the foreign countries, particularly England and France. They will not be taken with and Germany. They will not be taken with that kind of respect that happened in the previous decades. This is one phenomena. That is, language of both the countries is becoming a kind of a contentious project. If one knows English, one here caters to the interests of the British and people who support the British in India. And if you take up the cause of Sanskrit or Arabic or Persian back home in Europe, then you are taking up the cause of the people who have been colonized by you. So nobody will take an interest in that. So this is one particular contention that occurred in the opening years of the 19th century. The other thing was, and this was more serious, that the more of spread of English in the first few years of the 19th century would create conditions in which people would know more and more of the message of the English texts. And what was the message? This is very important, and this is something that is to be kept in mind, because this will make the Englishmen in India rather self-conscious. That what they do here is one thing, but what their texts say in the context of humanity in general and in the context of people in particular, that is going against the interests of the Britishers themselves. Well, maybe it's an idea which is abstract. So let me give you an example. When one was reading English language, let's say in the Indian universities or Indian colleges classroom, no universities then, Indian colleges classroom, then one would come in contact with the best writing of English in the last 200 or 300 years. So people would be, reading Shakespeare, they would be reading Milton, and if one came to the contemporary writing, then they would be reading Romantics. What message would Shakespeare give to the Indians, who are learning English anew of late? This is an important question. What do we learn from Shakespeare? Does Shakespeare tell anywhere that Englishmen or the Western people are superior to us? Nowhere. He doesn't say this. In fact, if you read Shakespeare's plays closely, you realize that he seems to be rather critical of and contemptuous towards the upper sections, the kings and queens. He calls them as much, human is a very, very loaded term, but then kings and queens are human beings. Human being means that they are open to flaws. Human beings doesn't mean that they connect with us, that they also are human beings, and they have no divinity about them. Shakespeare does not bother much about the divinity that is accompanied, that is there in the kings and queens and the princes. He doesn't bother about this. He shows them as making schemes, plotting, conspiring. They can be as petty, as mean, as violent. They can be as human as anybody else. So Shakespeare is that kind of a realist. And if Shakespeare is taught in India this way, that kings and queens are nothing but human beings and they have as much pettiness as others would have, so why should he bother about them? So this is the kind of emotion, this is the kind of sentiment that would get across the Indian reader when one read Sanskrit, when one read Shakespeare. This was one part. Now the Britishers who came to live here for some time, they would have their social life, and their social life would sometimes entail presentation of Shakespeare on the stage for their own limited audience. And when Shakespeare was staged here, then Shakespeare would be much more clearly visible as a source of reality, as a source of knowing reality, as a source of realism in India. And therefore Indians would be so much in love with these stories that were there in the Shakespeare text. They would be so much interested in those stories, and they would be so much entertained by those stories that they would start presenting these stories, of course on their understanding, in the Indian languages. So in the first half of the 19th century, you would have productions of Shakespeare in Indian languages, or the people who Indians who knew English, then they would be presenting them in English also. So either way, the question can be asked as to why Shakespeare is so popular in India in the 19th century. And this question is there before the audience, it is there for the scholars even today. Why was Shakespeare popular in India in the early years of the 19th century? And our answer today would be that Shakespeare is popular because Shakespeare did not have the kind of blind prejudices that the Britishers showed at that time. So Britishers would have squirmed when they saw that Indians were liking Shakespeare for a reason for which they may not like Shakespeare. So you have this kind of first thing I already told you about the value that language imparted to the Indian people who knew English. The second point is that a wrong kind of message from the British angle, from the British point of view, was going to the Indian writers that who knew for instance, Shakespeare would call the bluff of all the superiority business. He would say nothing is superior, things are as bad here as there, and if there are palace coups, if they are plottings, and if there are conspiracies in the Indian families, etc., the same thing happens in the case of the English kings also. So both kings are equally good or bad. So Shakespeare would show this, and Indians would definitely like it. And if that is how Indians are made to respond to English literature, a message that they want to send across directly, and a message that comes from Shakespeare, then definitely they would feel somewhat self-conscious regarding this. So this is one thing, and this impacted Indian imagination. Indian writing, there's not much of prose writing till the 19th century, but then in whatever of writing was available in India, in the Indian conditions, by Indians, in Indian languages, that would never show this kind of an attitude. So, in fact, realism of a kind where human beings are human beings, whether they are born rich or poor, and that they have to be taken not very seriously, not with a sense of respect, but as real human beings. Now, this is a new idea for Indians. Indians would always say that by definition, Brahmins are superior, kings are superior, people of the upper group sections are superior. That's the usual thing. But when they read English literature, then they realize that actually that's not the case, because a person is superior not on the basis of one's birth, not that one is a king or one is a poor person. In fact, what Shakespeare sometimes would show, in his plays would be that the poor people have more of simplicity and more of virtue, and they are better Christians, within quotes. Christian means simple people, all the time having sympathy and compassion for others. Now, this compassion is found in Shakespeare's case in the supposedly minor characters of Shakespeare's plays. So, the wrong message was going through literature. So, you learn a language in India, that language is English, your value, social value is increased. At the same time, through English, you are also getting the message that people are as bad here as they were elsewhere. The people elsewhere were as bad as their people here. So, this is a message that English people do not want to hear. So, they become self-conscious. But then Indian imagination is now strengthened. It is getting inspiration from this kind of an idea which is new to it. The new idea is that human beings are at the center of the world, and these human beings are good or bad according to the conditions in which they live, and these people can become better or worse with the passage of time. Imagine, this is a view which is very modern, and India never had it. English people here, those who lived here, did not want to give this message to Indians, that things are, could be good here and bad back home. They would always say that they were superior. So, literature was, and English language was, having this kind of a dual role to play, the good role and the bad role. The good role for them, that is, the good role that English was superior, and the bad role that, English literature was telling the Indian people that, well, England and India, they both had their share of evil. They both had their share of good also, more or less on equal terms. So, this is something, this democratic feeling, this democratic consciousness of equality, consciousness of social justice, which is there in the English writing of the time that was made available to the Indian reader. This thing, bothered the Englishman here no end. So, this is very important, and this impacted Indian imagination. People started thinking differently. I'll give a word now to this, and that word is modernity. India had not been modern till that time. India had not been realist till that time, except in the case of certain writers in specific phases. That apart, it had not actually seeped down to the masses. This kind of realism, they had their own kind of realism. We cannot ever, blame the masses. But what I am saying is that literature made available to the Indians in a formal form, this kind of a literature is very little in India in the 18th and 19th centuries, because they haven't had that kind of exposure to the processes of life that the Western countries, the European countries had in the phase of Renaissance. I don't have to go into that at the moment, but then let me tell you that two messages were put across in the early years of 19th century on parallel terms. One message that English language and the English people, they are superior, and the other message that English language is the language of justice, is the language of equality, is the language which is very close to life. So, this message is going, and these two messages, the good message and the bad message, the way one looks at it, the good message is bad for one section and vice versa. So, this is a very interesting process, and it occurs, and this brings in a big way what is called the phase of modernism in India. Modernism, not in today's terms, but modernism is modern versus the orthodox, the old. So, this is one part. The realism of English literature was made available through English language in India. I hope this point is somewhat clear to us at the moment. The second thing is that the contemporary writing, so far I talked to Shakespeare, and one can also talk of Milton, but I don't have to give examples in that detail. The specific contemporary writing in England was that of what can be called disillusionment. Of course, there is a lot of illusion talked about with respect to Romanticism, the Romantic poets, but Romantic poetry actually is the poetry of not illusion but disillusionment. I'm just turning things upside down a bit. What made Romanticism emerge in England, apart from influences coming from here and there, from Italy, from Germany, etc., what makes Romanticism strike roots in England in the latter half of the 18th century and the early part of the 19th century, the same period that I am discussing. This period, so far as English literature is concerned, belongs to Romanticism. I am not talking of India, I am talking of English literature. There is no Romantic literature of the kind that we understand by the term in the years of the first half of the 18th century. It comes only in the middle of let's say between 1850 and 1920 or so. These 60, 70 years, they belong to the Romantic period. And what is so specific about this period? And how is romantic? Actually, it should not be called romantic. It's very, very humanistic. So how call this romantic? The reason is that Romanticism appears to be a kind of reaction in English literature to the old ways, the ways of the state, the ways of the church, the ways of religion, the ways of philosophy, the ways of the city life. English Romanticism is a direct reaction to, is a direct rejection of whatever happens in the court, whatever happens in the world of trade, whatever happens in the world of economic prosperity. English Romanticism rejects it. And let me tell you how it rejects. Think of Blake. Who are the heroes for Blake? Blake is a Romantic poet, one of the first Romantic poets. Then you have Wordsworth, then you have Coleridge. What does Wordsworth say in his poems? A Romantic poet. He talks about the village that is being destroyed by the modern conditions, the contemporary conditions. This is Shakespeare's message. Shakespeare says it in poetry. Shakespeare says it in his preface to Lyrical Ballads, which is an introductory piece and a longish introductory piece full of analysis and insights. And there, Wordsworth says this, and there Wordsworth talks about the simplicity of life in his country, in the village, and the simplicity of language that is vitally connected with the simplicity of life. So you talk about simple life, you talk about simple you talk in simple words. That is what Romanticism is. Now, how come that something that is connected with village and the thing that is connected with simple language will be called illusory or romantic or imaginative alone? These are the things that one has to consider, and that is why when Romantics were read by Indians in India in the early part of the 19th century, then Indian mind got swayed. So realism of Shakespeare and the Romanticism of the Romantic poets, which is hardly romantic, I said, but it's very inspiring, it's very encouraging, it's very heartening for Indians to read Romantic poetry, because India at that time is a country of the villages, where people live in their life at the simple level. And when they do that, then English Romanticism makes the Indian mind aware about the simplicity and the genuineness and the authenticity of the Indian ways. Therefore, the first poets in English in India are poets who are, within quotes, romantic. Romantic means simple. Romantic means the real village. The village which is being threatened here also by others. So that village, is thought to be now foregrounded. It is thought to be centered, and that is what the early poets of India who are writing in English are saying this. The other thing, the Indian poets of the period whose imagination got the impact from the West, from England particularly, would be that they were taking up the cause of the poor, indirectly in the beginning, directly later. If the village was good, then one had to come to terms with the village along with the villager. So what was villager doing in India at that point of time? The villager in India was suffering much more than the villager in the West. I don't have to go into the details of the Western life, but think of the Indian village in the 19th century. What was happening in India in the Indian village at that time? This is a question that we should ask, and we should, because there was not much of polity, there was not much of governance, there was not much of economic policies that would help the producer here, the peasant. Therefore, agriculture would be neglected, trade will also suffer, and because there was a lot of law and order problem, and there was very weak government in India and in different parts of the country. Therefore, the village suffered a great deal. So, entirely the village economy would depend on the monsoon, and if there is no government working, if the alternative sources of power of water are not available, if irrigation is being neglected in India at that point of time, what's going to happen? Famines will occur, and in fact, the infamous phenomena of famines occurring at regular intervals in India in the 19th century is shocking. How many famines would you have in the 19th century alone? 6 famines, 7 famines, 8 famines, each worse than the other, each deadlier than the other. How many people will die in the Indian famine in the 19th century? It starts with thousands, then it goes to lakhs, then millions, and sometimes more than that. So these people die, in a year of famine or in 2 or 3 years of famine. Let's say a million people die, or 2 million people die. Sometimes even 10 million people die, and they die of hunger, they die of starvation, they die of lack of resources. So this is what is happening in India at that time. And the Indian romantic poet in English, supposedly romantic, this person will talk about the village. So definitely he will talk about the scarcity in the village, the poverty in the village, and by that term, by that particular preference for talking about the village and its sufferer, these people become great realists. They become great critics of the present conditions. So imagine that the Indian imagination at that point of time takes inspiration from people, realists like Shakespeare, the visionaries like Milton, and with the rebels like the romantics. And therefore, if somebody says that there is a Bengal Renaissance, then Bengal Renaissance means the Bengal poets who learnt English, who were inspired by the trends in English literature, and who wrote like the English writers of their own time, and who became great critics of society. So let's say that the Bengal Renaissance, or it's called the Young Bengal, young people of 20 or 25, they are writing wonderful poetry, and it's very much pro-village. It's very much about India, and it talks about the English bureaucracy directly or indirectly, and criticizes it. So you write in English, you use the language of the foreigner, and you are criticizing its bureaucracy, and you are taking up the cause of the Indian village. It's a remarkable phenomenon in the 19th century. And in fact, if English literature, English writing in India became popular, it was on the back of these people who were active at that time in India at the level of literature. So you have this group of young people in Bengal. They are called Young Bengal, and they are a phenomenon, and they are writing poetry. And some of the Indians who are inspired by the Bengal phenomena, they are writing plays in a new kind, and there will be novelists at that point of time who will be writing about India, its suffering, its women, it is downtrodden. The people, the young girls, who were married at the age of 6 or 7, and when they became widows at the age of 10 or so, then they would be burnt on the funeral pyre of their husband. So this kind of a thing, the English writers in India would take up, they will talk about hunger and starvation, and therefore Indian literature at that point of time is not much talking about these things. But then people who were writing in English in India, these would be inspired by these writers, and then they would take up their own cause in the languages in which they were active. So in a way, a kind of a seed is being sown in India of realism and of modernity, and of a kind that will inspire a large number of people later. So if in the second half of the 19th century there is a spate of Indian writing, which is going to further the cause of progress, which will further the cause of social justice, then that happens because of the English coming here to a large extent, and English giving a message counter to the message that was given by the upper castes and classes in India at that point of time. So with these words, I was supposed to talk about Indian imagination, and the Indian imagination is taking a different kind of a turn now, and it is that which is to be appreciated. The influence came from the West in this way through a language which was not our language. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much. And dear friends, if you want to give your feedback for this particular lecture, then you can mail us at info.cc@nic.in. We would be meeting again very soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.